The alien girl stood on the surface of the planet, staring out into the vast landscape below Kthao. Was her home a world defined by its relentless struggles, where every living thing, from the smallest insect to the largest predator, had evolved for one single purpose: to survive and dominate? She had been raised in this environment from birth. Her species had long since conquered their violent world and turned it into a breeding ground for the strongest and most vicious fighters. She had known nothing but battle, every battle fought with fangs and claws, weapons forged from bone and steel in her hand, and the death of her enemies in her mind. They were the Deathworlders, the apex of survival creatures, whose strength was unmatched across the galaxy. She had never met anyone from any other species who could hold a candle to her. She had destroyed entire squads of elite soldiers from other planets without breaking a sweat. And yet here she stood on the edge of a new world, wondering if this mission might be different. There was something about this planet that intrigued her. It was still in its early stages of colonization, its people primitive but resilient. They had already developed rudimentary tools and had hunger for expansion, but it was the humans themselves that caught her interest. She had heard of them before, stories passed down by those who had encountered them in other parts of the galaxy. They were nothing more than small, fragile creatures. By her standards, their bodies were weak and soft, their technology primitive. Yet, somehow they had survived in a galaxy filled with far superior species. Something about them had allowed them to thrive where others had perished. She landed her ship on the outskirts of a human settlement, choosing to observe rather than engage immediately. From her vantage point, she saw them moving about like ants, tiny beings, unaware of the predator. Watching from above, the humans went about their lives with a sense of normalcy, as if the galaxy around them was nothing to fear. They had built homes from stone and metal, crude compared to her species' technology, but functional. They hunted and gathered their food relying on rudimentary weapons, none of which impressed her. She would easily overwhelm them if needed, she thought. But there was a lingering curiosity, one that had begun to gnaw at her insides. She had heard stories of humans facing seemingly impossible odds, yet surviving time and time again. What made them different? She had no idea. She had no use for such weakness. They were just another species that would eventually fall under her might. As she prepared to exit the ship and explore further, a sudden explosion shook the ground. Her instincts flared, and in a heartbeat she reached for her weapons, her hands steady. As she prepared for battle, the humans below were under attack. She could hear the sounds of their screams and the distant crackle of weapons fire. Her gaze sharpened, and she spotted them. The attackers were a group of hostile natives, far larger and stronger than the humans, and they were advancing on the settlement. Without hesitation, the alien girl took off in a blur of motion, her legs propelling her forward. With the speed of a predator, she landed in the midst of the chaos, without hesitation, tearing through the attackers with a brutality that would leave any lesser being paralyzed with fear. She was a whirlwind of destruction. No creature could survive in her wake. But amidst the carnage, something unexpected happened. One of the humans stood his ground despite the chaos around him. His expression was calm, as if he had seen this before. He wasn't running or panicking. Instead, he was organizing the survivors, shouting orders and directing them to safety. She briefly wondered if he was simply unaware of the danger, or if he had some kind of death wish. She didn't care. He was weak, fragile in comparison to her. And yet, there was something in the way he moved, something in the way he commanded his people that caught her attention. She had no time for distractions. The enemies were still advancing, and she sliced through them with ruthless efficiency. But the human remained unshaken. As the last of the attackers fell to the ground, her gaze shifted back to him. He was standing there, still calm and focused amid the wreckage of battle, as if he had expected this and handled it 1,000 times before. That feeling gnawed at her again. Curiosity, perhaps a foolish trait, but a trait nonetheless. This human was different from the others. She had encountered his calm in the face of certain death, his control over his people, his lack of fear. Something about him struck her as strange, and she found herself wanting to learn more, but she dismissed the thought quickly. She was here to conquer and nothing more. She had no time to waste on strange humans who thought themselves worthy of her attention. And yet, as she began to walk away, she heard his voice calling after her. It was direct and clear, an invitation to speak with him. And in that moment she knew something would change, something she could not predict, something about this human would make her question everything she thought she knew about power and survival. The alien girl hesitated for a moment as the human's voice echoed through the chaos, still lingering in the air. His tone was calm, even respectful. Despite the violence that had just unfolded, she couldn't help but turn back and look at him. The human remained standing in the same spot, his eyes meeting hers without fear. There was no sign of panic, no hesitation, as if he had seen death before and knew exactly how to handle it. His posture was unassuming yet confident, in a way that irked her. Why wasn't he afraid? Didn't he understand how dangerous she was, how deadly her species could be? She had just torn through an entire group of their enemies in seconds. And yet here he was unshaken, not a single hint of fear in his stance. She had never encountered anything like this before. The human was clearly not like the other fragile creatures she had observed so far, but he was still weak compared to her in every way. He lacked her strength, her speed, her instincts. He was just a fragile human. And yet, there was something there that made her pause, something about the way he held himself that made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had underestimated him. She stepped forward, her boots crunching on the dirt. As she moved toward him, he didn't flinch or back away. Even as she approached, his eyes remained fixed on hers with a look that held no hint of aggression, but only quiet curiosity. She couldn't place it. What was it that made him so different from the others she had encountered? He had no power to match her speed, no physical ability to compete with her strength, and yet his presence was undeniable. It made her feel something unfamiliar, a sense of unease that she could not quite explain. He was just one human among many, yet he carried himself in a way that made her feel like he was a force to be reckoned with. Despite his size, despite his limitations, it was almost as if he was unafraid to face what she represented, and that in itself made him dangerous. "You fought well," he said, his voice low but steady. His words were simple and direct, but there was no hesitation in them. She felt her pride surge at the compliment. And yet she was confused. Why was he speaking to her at all? Why didn't he just run off like the others did? Wasn't that what the weak were supposed to do? When faced with something far superior to them, didn't they cower? Didn't they flee? She could feel a part of her growing irritated at how nonchalant he was. He was a human, after all, fragile and soft. His species should not have been able to stand up to anything like the beasts they had just fought. And yet he had given orders without fear, had directed his people to safety, as if he had done it 1,000 times before. She wanted to dismiss him as an anomaly, something unworthy of her attention. But she couldn't bring herself to do it. Something about him gnawed at her thoughts like a puzzle she couldn't solve. "You should be more careful," he continued, as he took a step closer, his eyes scanning the area, as if the battle had never happened, as if everything was already behind them. His focus was entirely on her, and she felt herself grow even more irritated. How could he be so calm after all of that? How could he act like it was nothing, like it was just another day to him? She was a deadly warrior. She had been trained to fight and survive since the moment she was born, yet here was this human speaking to her like an equal. And for the first time she questioned her place in this galaxy. Was this human really so weak? Or was there something she had missed, some power she had yet to understand in them? She had no answer to that question, and it made her feel unsettled. "Do you always act this way?" she asked, her voice sharp with the edge of frustration. She couldn't help it. The human's behavior was baffling, and she found herself wanting to push back to see how far she could go to make him react, to show her his weakness. And yet he just smiled at her, a slight but genuine smile that held no mockery, no fear, only understanding. That smile threw her off balance. More than anything else, he wasn't trying to manipulate her or belittle her. He wasn't pretending to be her equal. He was simply existing, and it made her feel like she was the one out of place. "I've learned to adapt," he said simply, his words carrying a weight she didn't fully understand. There was something in them that made her pause, and for the first time she began to wonder if the true danger was not in his fragility, but in his ability to survive. Despite it all, she had always believed that strength came from physical power, that survival was about dominating the world around you, but this human seemed to be telling her something different. He had survived by adapting, not by overpowering the world, but by fitting himself into it. And that thought alone was enough to make her take a step back from the certainty she had always held about her own superiority. The alien girl stood frozen for a moment, the human's words still hanging in the air. Like an unanswered question, his smile lingered in her mind far longer than it should have. She had never been one to question her beliefs. Her entire existence had been centered on survival through strength, yet here she was standing in front of a creature she had once dismissed as weak, who somehow made her doubt everything she knew about power. It was infuriating. His calm demeanor, his unshakable composure, made her feel like an intruder on her own beliefs. Everything she had worked for her entire life suddenly seemed fragile in the face of his quiet resilience. "You don't get it, do you?" she muttered more to herself than to him as she shifted her weight uneasily. She had always prided herself on her strength, her speed, her ability to overcome any challenge placed before her, and yet standing here now she felt out of place. She had always been able to crush her enemies with sheer force. She had been taught that dominance was the ultimate goal, that no one should be allowed to survive unless they were strong enough to fight for their place. But this human was something else. He wasn't just surviving, he was thriving in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. The human's gaze remained steady, his expression unchanged. He didn't seem offended or even challenged by her words. He simply watched her with those quiet eyes that held no fear, but a strange sort of understanding. And in that moment, she realized he wasn't trying to prove something to her. He wasn't trying to show her how strong he was. He wasn't trying to match her in any way. He was simply being himself. And that made her feel small in comparison. Her entire worldview had always been about proving superiority, but this human seemed to be telling her that maybe survival wasn't about crushing others, maybe it was about fitting into the world without destroying it. "So you really think you've got the answers?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. She wasn't sure why she was challenging him so much. It was as if something inside her had snapped, something that had always held her convictions in place, something she had thought was unbreakable. He seemed to have torn at it with nothing more than a few words and a calm smile. "You think that just because you can survive, you figured it all out?" She was almost daring him to prove her wrong. "No, I don't think I've figured everything out," he said calmly, his voice as steady as ever. "But I've learned something important. I've learned that surviving isn't about being the strongest. It's about knowing how to handle what comes your way." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that she wasn't used to seeing in any creature so much smaller than herself. "It's about understanding the world around you and adapting to it before it breaks you." The alien girl felt her mind racing. Her entire life had been spent training to be the strongest, to be the deadliest, to conquer and destroy. But this human was telling her something completely different. He wasn't telling her to give up strength. He was saying something far more unsettling, that there was more to survival than just brute force, more to strength than just power alone. And that thought shook her to her core. She had never had to think about how the world might break her. She had always been the one doing the breaking. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her heart pounding in her ears. There was a tension growing between them, but she couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, something that made her question every belief she had ever held about herself and about the universe. The human seemed to sense her internal struggle. He didn't press her or try to convince her of anything else. He simply stood there, allowing her to work through whatever thoughts were racing through her mind without interrupting her. But that was part of what unsettled her so much. He wasn't forcing her to change. He was simply existing in front of her, challenging her worldview without saying a word, and that made him even more dangerous than any warrior she had ever faced. "You've survived by being clever," she said. After a long pause, her voice quieter now, the words feeling heavier as she said them. Perhaps for the first time she was willing to admit that there was something to what he said. It wasn't just strength that kept him alive, it was his mind, and the way he used it to navigate the world. He wasn't like her. He wasn't like any of the fighters she had known. He didn't rely on his physical abilities. He relied on his understanding of everything around him. And in that understanding, he was more powerful than she had ever imagined. "That's one way to put it," he replied with a slight grin, his words leaving her speechless for a moment. It was strange to think that such a fragile being had the ability to leave her questioning herself in ways she never had before. She had spent her entire life believing that to be the strongest was to be the best, but now the human had shown her that survival wasn't about being the strongest. It was about being something else, something more subtle, something she wasn't sure she fully understood yet. The alien girl stood still, her mind spinning. As she processed his words, the human wasn't like anyone she had ever met. Before, he wasn't afraid of her strength, he wasn't intimidated by her power, and that in itself was a strange concept, something she couldn't quite wrap her mind around. Every fiber of her being screamed that she was the dominant force in the universe, that nothing could match her prowess in battle. Yet here was this fragile human standing before her, without a shred of fear. He wasn't pretending to be her equal, he wasn't pretending to be a warrior. Like her, he was simply being himself. And in his own way, he was forcing her to question everything she had ever believed about strength. It irritated her more than anything she had ever experienced. She had been trained her entire life to believe that the strongest survived and the weak perished. She had been taught that power came from the ability to crush all who stood in your way. But this human didn't rely on power, he relied on something else, something far less tangible, but far more dangerous: the ability to think, the ability to survive, without the need for violence, to adapt to whatever environment or situation he found himself in. And that realization was slowly eating away at her certainty in a way she couldn't ignore. "How do you survive in a world like this?" she finally asked, her voice almost softer than she intended. The question wasn't just a challenge anymore, it was genuine curiosity. The world she knew was one of constant battle, where the strong triumphed over the weak, where every decision was based on who had the most force and the most power. But this human's world seemed so different. His world seemed to revolve around something entirely foreign to her, and she couldn't help but wonder how he had learned to survive in such a place without the tools she relied on every day. The human glanced at her, a look of contemplation crossing his face. Before he answered, "We adapt," he said simply, his voice steady and calm. "It's not about brute strength. It's about finding ways to work with what you have, to use your surroundings to your advantage, to be aware of everything that could hurt you, and turn it to your benefit. It's about seeing the world as it is, not how you want it to be, and knowing how to fit yourself into it without destroying everything in your path." The words hit her harder than she expected. She had never thought about survival in such a way. She had always believed that the world was something to be conquered, something to be dominated by sheer force and power. But now the human was speaking of survival as if it was a puzzle to be solved, a game to be played with patience and understanding. And that idea unsettled her in a way that made her feel small, like she had missed something important her entire life, like there was a truth to survival that she had never understood. "But you're still weak," she blurted out before she could stop herself. The words felt harsh as they left her mouth, and for a moment she regretted saying them, but she couldn't take them back now. Instead of reacting with anger or frustration, the human simply looked at her for a long moment, and then he shrugged. "It's true, I'm weak compared to you," he admitted, "but that doesn't mean I'm helpless. It doesn't mean I don't have the tools to survive. And that's what matters. We all have our strengths in different ways. It's just a matter of knowing what they are and using them the best we can." She wanted to argue, she wanted to prove that power was the only true strength, but his calm demeanor and the quiet conviction in his words made her hesitate. For the first time in her life, she wasn't sure she had all the answers. She didn't know if power alone was the only path to survival. Maybe there was something to what he was saying. Maybe survival wasn't just about fighting and dominating. Maybe it was about understanding and adapting. Maybe he was right. Maybe strength came in forms she had never considered. But that thought only made her more frustrated. It was as though everything she had ever known was slipping through her fingers like sand, and she had no way of stopping it. She had always been certain of her place in the universe, certain that her strength was enough to overcome anything, and yet this human had made her question that certainty with nothing more than his calm words and his quiet confidence. She didn't know how to deal with that. She took a deep breath and looked away, trying to gather her thoughts. She needed to find a way to regain control. She couldn't allow this human to make her doubt herself. She couldn't let him shake the foundation of everything she had believed in. And yet, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe there was more to survival than just crushing your enemies underfoot. Maybe there was a wisdom she had overlooked, a way of being that didn't rely on brute force, but on intelligence and adaptability. The alien girl clenched her fists at her sides, frustration building in her chest. She had always believed that to be the strongest was to be the best, but this human was showing her a different way. And it was a way that didn't involve power or violence. It involved something far more elusive, something that made her feel like she was just beginning to understand the true nature of strength. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure if her way was the right one. The alien girl stood there in silence, the weight of her thoughts pressing down on her shoulders. She had always been the hunter, the one who moved through the galaxy with ease, crushing all obstacles in her path. Her strength had never been questioned until now. The human had given her something to think about, something that made her wonder if she had been wrong. Al, along her eyes, flickered back to him, his posture still calm, his expression unchanged. He wasn't looking at her with disdain or anger, just quiet patience. And that patience was beginning to unravel her. Everything she thought she knew about power and survival was being peeled away piece by piece. And she didn't know how to handle it. She turned her back to him, walking a few paces away, her mind racing. She had always believed that power was the key to survival, that only the strong deserved to live, that weakness was something to be crushed beneath her heel. But this human had turned all of that upside down. He didn't rely on physical power or sheer force. Instead, he used his mind to navigate the world and to survive. And that thought made her feel small. It made her feel like she had been operating on a false belief her entire life. And it infuriated her. "Why are you so calm?" she finally asked, her voice sharp, but filled with a growing frustration. She stopped pacing and turned back to him, her fists clenched by her sides. "You've just seen what I can do. And you don't even seem to care. You don't seem afraid. Don't you know what I'm capable of? Don't you realize that I could kill you without even breaking a sweat?" The human's gaze met hers once again with that quiet, unshakable calm. He didn't flinch or look away. He simply stood there, as if he had all the time in the world to listen to her words. And that unnerved her more than anything else. He wasn't afraid. And that made him seem like more of a threat than any monster she had ever faced. He took a breath before speaking, his voice steady and clear. "I'm not afraid of you," he said. "I don't fear strength, but I do respect it. And I can see that you're powerful, but power alone doesn't guarantee survival. You have to be more than just strong. You have to be smart enough to know when to fight and when to wait, when to act and when to observe, because sometimes brute force isn't enough. Sometimes it's about knowing the situation and using it to your advantage." The alien girl took a step forward, her gaze narrowing. "You think I don't know how to survive?" she demanded, her voice filled with the sting of her pride. "I've survived more battles than you can imagine. I've killed more creatures than you could count. I know what it means to fight. And to win, I am the strongest. I am the ultimate predator. And you're telling me that I don't know how to survive?" The human didn't flinch. He just watched her with those piercing eyes, not judging her, but simply observing. "I'm not saying you don't know how to survive," he said. "It's clear that you do. But survival is more than just being the strongest. It's about knowing when to use that strength and when not to, and that's something you have to learn in a world that's constantly changing, in a galaxy full of creatures that don't follow the rules you're used to. You can't always rely on power alone. Sometimes the best way to win is to not fight at all." The words stung. And for the first time she found herself questioning them. She had never considered the possibility that survival might require more than just overpowering your enemies. She had never considered that sometimes not fighting was the smartest option. She had always believed that to survive you had to fight and dominate and crush everything in your path. But now the human was showing her a different way. And it was a way that felt alien to her. He had survived without power. He had survived with his mind, with his ability to read the world and adapt to it. And that made him more dangerous than any opponent she had ever faced, because it was a kind of strength that she didn't know how to fight against. It wasn't something she could just crush with her fists. It wasn't something she could defeat with speed or power. It was something she had to learn to understand, and that scared her more than anything else. "So what now?" she asked, her voice quieter now, her anger simmering down to a simmering frustration. She had never been in a position where she didn't know how to handle a situation, where her strength wasn't enough to solve the problem. But now she found herself facing a dilemma. She didn't know how to deal with. The human had forced her to see things differently, and she wasn't sure if she was ready to accept it, but she also couldn't ignore it. The human smiled at her, not a mocking smile, but a genuine one. "You're learning," he said, his tone warm, but still grounded in that calm confidence. "Maybe that's the first step in surviving this world and in surviving everything that's ahead of you, because sometimes survival isn't about being the strongest, it's about knowing when to fight and when to be something else entirely. The alien girl felt the sting of the human's words still lingering in her chest. She could feel her breath quicken as she processed what he had said. Survival wasn't just about fighting, it wasn't just about strength, it wasn't just about crushing every enemy in your path. And that realization left her feeling lost for the first time in her life. She had always known what to do when faced with danger: fight, dominate, survive. But now she wasn't so sure anymore. The human wasn't showing her weakness. He wasn't showing her fear. He was showing her something else, something she hadn't known how to look for. He was showing her a new kind of strength. And it made her feel like she was on unstable ground. For the first time in her life, she wasn't in control. And that thought was terrifying. "You think you've got all the answers, don't you?" She spat the words out before she could stop herself, her anger flaring again. It was easier to be angry than to admit that she was starting to doubt herself. She had never been wrong before. She had always been the one with the answers, always the one who knew exactly what to do in any situation. But now she wasn't so sure anymore, and that scared her more than anything she had ever faced. The human's expression didn't change. He didn't flinch or even show signs of being offended. He simply stood there, his eyes locked with hers. "I never said I had all the answers," he replied calmly. "I said that survival isn't just about strength, but it's also about understanding the world around you, knowing when to act and when to let things play out. It's about being aware of your surroundings and being able to adapt to whatever comes next, not just fighting everything in front of you. Sometimes the best way to survive is to not fight at all." She wanted to argue with him. She wanted to tell him that he didn't understand, that he couldn't understand the way she had lived, the way she had fought and killed to survive, the way she had used every ounce of her power to dominate. But something in his voice stopped her. She knew he wasn't speaking from a place of weakness. He wasn't trying to show her how to be weak. He was showing her how to survive in a way she hadn't considered. And that thought gnawed at her. She took a step back, her mind racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that the human was right, that there was something to what he was saying, something she had missed all these years. And that realization was both terrifying and exhilarating. For the first time in her life, she was beginning to question everything she thought she knew about strength and survival. "I don't understand," she said finally, her voice quieter now. She didn't look at him as she spoke, her eyes focused on the ground. As she tried to make sense of what he had said, for the first time she was vulnerable. She didn't have the answers, she didn't have the strength to keep moving forward with her old ways. And that frightened her. "I don't know how to survive without fighting." How do you survive in a world like this, without using power, without using force? The human stepped forward slowly, his gaze never leaving her. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to offer an answer. He simply waited for her to finish speaking before he responded. "You survive by learning when to fight and when not to fight," he said, his voice softening just enough to show understanding. "You survive by knowing the world around you, knowing the rules of the game, and using those rules to your advantage. But more than that, you survive by accepting that there are things you can't control. And when that happens, you adapt. You don't fight against everything. Sometimes you have to let go and let the world change around you instead of trying to force it to change on your terms." His words echoed in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. She had always believed that survival was about strength, and that strength alone was what would keep her alive. But now he was telling her that it wasn't enough to just be strong. You had to understand the world, you had to adapt to it. And that made her feel as if she had been walking through her life, blindfolded, unable to see the bigger picture. "You don't get it," she muttered under her breath, her frustration building again. "You don't know what it's like to be strong. You don't know what it's like to have to fight for your place in the world. Every single day, you don't understand what it means to have to destroy everything in your path to stay alive." The human's gaze softened for a moment, his expression almost sympathetic, but there was no pity in his eyes, just a calm understanding, and that made her feel more vulnerable than ever. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't know what it's like to live your life, but I do know that strength isn't just about destroying everything in your path. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to walk away when the fight isn't worth it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to know when to step back and adapt to something new." She didn't know what to say to that. She felt the weight of his words settling over her like a cloak. She had never considered walking away from a fight before. She had always thought that was a sign of weakness. But now she wasn't so sure. Maybe there was strength in choosing not to fight. Maybe there was more to survival than just physical power. The alien girl's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. She wanted to be angry, she wanted to scream and lash out at the human, but something inside her stopped her. It wasn't fear, it wasn't submission, but something else, something she had never experienced before. She didn't know how to fight against the truth of his words, how to deny the growing seed of doubt inside her. She had always been the predator, the one who dominated, the one who controlled her fate with strength and power. But now she was starting to see that maybe there was another way to survive, a way that didn't involve crushing everything around her. Maybe she wasn't as invincible as she thought. Maybe the world wasn't just a battleground for her to conquer, and that thought unsettled her more than anything she had ever felt. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The frustration was building inside her, a pressure she didn't know how to release. She had always relied on her instincts, her power, and now she was being forced to question everything she had ever believed in. She looked at the human standing there with his calm eyes, his peaceful demeanor, and for the first time she didn't see him as weak. She saw him as something entirely different, something dangerous, in a way she couldn't quite explain. "You're not like the others," she said, her voice quieter now. The anger that had once fueled her words was now replaced with something else, a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. She didn't know why she was still talking to him, why she was still trying to understand him. But she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't walk away from the puzzle. He presented the challenge that made her question everything she had known. The human didn't answer right away. He just watched her with those knowing eyes, as if waiting for her to come to her own conclusion. And that only made her feel more uneasy. He wasn't trying to force her to understand. He wasn't trying to prove anything to her. He was simply existing in a way that made her feel small and vulnerable. "You have no idea what it's like to live in a world like mine," she said, almost to herself, her voice trembling. For the first time in years, she was admitting a truth she had kept hidden even from herself. Her world had been nothing but battle and survival. Her people had survived by dominating others, by conquering and killing, and every moment had been a test of strength and will to live. But now she was beginning to see that maybe there was more to life than just survival. Maybe there was a different kind of strength, a strength she didn't understand. The human stepped closer, but not too close. His presence was a quiet force in itself. He didn't speak for a long, while he simply stood there, giving her the space to process what was happening inside her mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke softly. "You're right. I don't know what it's like to live in your world, but I do know what it's like to fight every day, to survive every day, to face things that seem impossible and still find a way to keep going." He paused, looking at her as though he could see into her very soul. "I know what it's like to feel like there's no way out, to feel like the world is closing in around you, and all you have is your strength to keep going. But I also know that strength alone isn't enough. I've seen what happens when you only rely on strength. It's not the path to survival, it's the path to destruction." Her heart raced as his words hit her like a physical blow. She had always believed that strength was all that mattered, that it was the key to survival, but the human was telling her something else, something that made her rethink everything she had ever known about the world. She had grown up in the world that had taught her to fight and kill to survive. She didn't know how to deal with what he was saying. She didn't know how to reconcile his words with her life. Everything she had worked for seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. "But what else is there?" she whispered almost to herself. The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it. What else is there? If not strength, if not power, what's the point of surviving if you don't have the strength to protect yourself and your people? The human's eyes softened, but he didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with something else, something that made her feel like he understood in a way no one ever had. "The point," he said, "is to survive in a way that doesn't destroy you, to find balance, to know that you don't always have to fight to win. Sometimes survival means understanding when to stop and when to change the course you're on. Strength is important, but it's not the only thing that keeps you alive." The words hit her like a wave crashing over her mind. It was too much, too fast. She couldn't process it all at once. It was as though the world she had known was shattering around her, and she was being forced to rebuild everything from the ground up. She didn't know how to survive without strength. She didn't know how to live without dominating everything around her. But the human was telling her that there was another way, and that way was as foreign to her as the stars themselves. She took another step back, her head spinning. She had always believed she was in control, that she was the one who held the power. But now she wasn't so sure. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. The foundation of her entire existence was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. The alien girl stood there, frozen, her mind reeling with the weight of the human's words. They echoed in her mind like a relentless storm. She could feel the ground beneath her shifting, like the very foundation of her world was crumbling away. And all she could do was watch as it fell apart around her. She had never felt so lost. She had never felt so small. She had always been the one in control, the one who shaped her destiny with strength and power. But now she wasn't sure of anything anymore. She didn't know who she was without that power, without that strength. To rely on the human was standing before her, waiting patiently, as if he knew the storm inside her was coming. And he wasn't afraid of it. But she couldn't stand still much longer. She had to move. She had to do something to stop the suffocating feeling that was rising in her chest. Her fists clenched at her sides as the frustration boiled inside her. She didn't know how to deal with what was happening to her. She didn't know how to process this new reality that the human had presented to her, a reality where power wasn't the only thing that mattered, where survival didn't mean crushing everything in your path. The idea made her feel weak. It made her feel like she was being stripped of everything that had ever defined her. She had always known exactly who she was. She was the hunter, the predator, the one who survived, because she was stronger than anyone else. But now she was questioning that, and it terrified her. She turned away from him, her back stiff and rigid. She couldn't face him. Not right now. Not while the storm inside her was so overwhelming. She needed to think. She needed to figure out how to make sense of all of this, how to find her place in a world that seemed to be shifting beneath her feet. Everything had always been so clear to her. She had never questioned her purpose before, but now everything was murky and uncertain. And she hated it. She hated the feeling of being adrift in a world that no longer made sense. "You can't keep running from this." The human's voice broke through her thoughts. His words were calm, steady, and they only made her frustration grow. She wasn't ready to face this. She wasn't ready to let go of the only way of life she had ever known. But deep down, she knew he was right. She couldn't keep running from the truth. No matter how hard she tried, it was there waiting for her to accept it, waiting for her to understand that strength wasn't the only way to survive. She took a deep breath and turned back to him, her eyes flashing with a mixture of anger and uncertainty. "I don't know how to do this," she said, her voice trembling despite herself. "I don't know how to survive without the power to crush everything around me. I've always been able to do that. It's how I've lived my whole life. It's how I've survived. But now you're telling me that's not enough. And I don't know how to change. I don't know what else I'm supposed to be." The human looked at her with that same calm gaze, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, but instead he took a step forward slowly, and without hesitation he spoke quietly. "You don't have to change who you are," he said. "You don't have to stop being strong. But you need to understand that strength isn't just about fighting or dominating. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is walk away when the fight isn't worth it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is understand that there's more than one way to survive, and not every battle has to be won with force." Her heart pounded in her chest as his words hit her like a wave crushing against a cliff. She wanted to argue, she wanted to shout that he was wrong. But deep down she knew he wasn't. She knew that he wasn't telling her to abandon everything she had ever known. He wasn't telling her to be weak. He was showing her that there was more to survival than just power, more to strength than simply defeating your enemies. But that realization was so difficult to accept. She had lived her entire life believing that power was the only thing that mattered, and now she was being told that there was another way, and she didn't know how to accept that. "I don't know how to stop fighting," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've never known how to stop. It's all I've ever done. It's who I am." "You don't have to stop fighting," he replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You just have to learn when to fight, and when to wait, when to use your strength, and when to hold it back, when to adapt to what's around you, rather than forcing the world to fit your expectations. It's not about giving up your power, it's about using it wisely." Her eyes locked onto his for a long moment as his words settled into her mind, and for the first time in her life, She felt the tiniest flicker of something new, something she didn't recognize. It wasn't weakness. It wasn't fear. It was something else. It was a kind of understanding, a kind of clarity that she had never known before. Maybe the human wasn't wrong. Maybe there was another way to survive in this galaxy, and maybe it was time for her to learn what that way was. She didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in a long, while she didn't feel like she had to have all the answers, maybe the human's path wasn't the one she would choose, but it was a path she could consider, a path that might offer her something more than just endless fighting and domination. And as terrifying as that idea was, it was also strangely comforting. The alien girl stood in silence, her thoughts racing as the human's words circled her mind. She felt as though she was standing on the edge of a precipice. Everything she had ever known was crumbling beneath her, and the only way forward was into the unknown. She had always thought survival was a simple equation: strength equals survival, power equals victory. But now she was being forced to confront the fact that maybe there was more to it, than that maybe the world didn't work the way she thought it did. Maybe she didn't have all the answers. Maybe she had been wrong all along, and the idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. She didn't know what to say to him. She didn't know how to express the confusion that was flooding her mind. She had always believed in the simplicity of strength, the simplicity of fighting and conquering. But now she was questioning everything she had ever built her life around. She wanted to tell the human that he didn't understand, that he couldn't possibly know what it was like to live her life, to survive in a world where strength was everything, but something inside her kept her silent. She didn't know why, but she knew it was because part of her was starting to believe that maybe he did understand, maybe he knew something she didn't, maybe there was a way to survive that didn't involve constant fighting and domination. The human watched her with that same patient calmness, as if he had all the time in the world to wait for her to figure things out. He didn't push her, he didn't pressure her, he simply stood there letting her process everything he had said, and everything she had felt. He was giving her space to come to her own conclusions, and that in itself felt like a kind of strength, something she had never encountered before in her life. "What do you want from me?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. She didn't look at him, her eyes focused on the ground beneath her feet. She had no idea what he expected from her. She had no idea what he was trying to show her. But something inside her was telling her that this was important, that this moment was crucial, that somehow her life had led her to this point, and she had to choose whether to keep following the path she had always known, or to step into the unknown and accept the possibility that everything she believed in could be wrong. "I want you to understand that there's more to survival than what you've been taught," he said, his voice soft but firm. "You don't have to let go of who you are. You don't have to abandon your strength. But you need to understand that there's more to being strong than just fighting. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is know when to step back, when to learn, when to grow, when to change. The world doesn't bend to strength alone, and neither should you." She clenched her fists, her mind still swirling with the weight of his words. She had always fought, because it was the only way she knew to survive. It was the only way she knew how to live, and now the human was telling her that maybe there was another way, a way that didn't involve constant conflict, didn't involve her imposing her will on everything around her, and that terrified her. It terrified her, because if she let go of her strength, if she accepted that there was more to survival than what she had always known, she would be admitting that she had been wrong, and that was something she wasn't sure she was ready to do. But deep down she knew that he wasn't wrong. She knew that what he was saying made sense. She had seen too many warriors like herself fall into the trap of believing that power was the only way to survive, and they had all ended up destroyed by their own arrogance and their own refusal to change. And she didn't want to be like them. She didn't want to end up as a forgotten relic of a time that had passed her by. But how could she change? How could she let go of everything she had ever believed in? "I don't know if I can do this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I can stop fighting. I don't know if I can change who I am." "You don't have to change who you are," he replied gently. "You just have to learn to be more than what you've always been. You can still be strong, but you have to learn to be wise enough to know when to fight and when not to. You have the power to survive, but you have to learn to use that power in a way that doesn't destroy you or everything around you." The words sank deep into her chest, and for the first time in her life, she began to see a different kind of strength, a strength that wasn't just about physical power or sheer what it was a strength that came from within, a strength that came from understanding herself and the world around her, a strength that didn't rely on domination, but on adaptation. And that thought sent a shiver down her spine. It was a strength she had never known, and yet it felt like the one thing she needed to learn in order to survive in a world that was no longer defined by brute force. She took a slow, deep breath, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to feel a sense of hope. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that the path she had always followed was no longer enough, and maybe, just maybe, the human was showing her a new way, a better way to live and survive.